I'm going to be giving you a brief introduction to the very, very basics of creating your own artificial neural networks using PyTorch. So for those of you who already have a lot of experience doing this, you feel free to zone out and take a look at some of the other great tutorials that were shared with you in Jeremy's at the end of Jeremy's last talk. But for those of you who haven't done this before, or who maybe have used neural networks like pre-trained networks, but haven't actually created your own, this is hopefully going to give you the sort of basic nuts and bolts to get started with that process. If you want a sort of more conceptual overview of this that's sort of tailored a little bit to social neuroscience, I recommend checking out my my preprint with Bo Sievers that you can find linked here. This is sort of a more like high-level intuitive overview of these things and not so much like the coding implementation side that we're going to focus on today. This will also be a nice example of using a Colab notebook, which Jeremy mentioned in the last session. So if you haven't used one of these before, this is your chance now. So the link to that is in the tutorials channel on Slack, and you can just go here. This one you can't collaboratively edit because I don't want people editing it as I go, but you can make a copy of it if you want to run the code yourself as we go along. I already have our code all sort of set up because some of it takes a little while to execute, so it's going to be ready and done. So I'm not going to be going on doing that. If you do it though, you're going to want to connect to a runtime that's a GPU runtime. That's going to be a lot faster for all of this. All right, so this is sort of a nice schematic view of sort of the bits and pieces of an artificial neural network. And we'll be looking at some of these and how to actually implement these in code today. This was illustrated by Lindsay as her first piece of professional science communication illustration. So well done, Lindsay. And so in the A panel over here, we have sort of the overall general structure. So we always have some kind of input layer. We could have multiple different types of inputs. They could be just a single input, as we're going to actually be working with in this notebook, or they could be a vector input, so sort of like a multiple regression where you have a bunch of numbers going into it. But they're actually even more flexible than that. So unlike most regression models that you've probably worked with, they can take tensors, which are just like higher dimensional vectors. They can have a square, like an image. You could take in like a hypercube or whatever sort of shape that you wanted to, and you can also feed in multiple like totally different images, totally different inputs. So if you wanted to feed in like say a word and a piece of like a word piece of text representation, and also an image and also an audio clip, etc., you can feed in all those different bits and pieces. Now, we're not going to get into all the details of that in this one introductory tutorial, but this flexibility, I think, is one of the reasons that makes neural networks sort of really cool, useful tools, especially for doing things like cognitive modeling, where if you want to understand something like all the different channels of information somebody's using in a social interaction, you really want to be able to feed in those totally different data formats at the same time. Within every one of these sort of circles over in that left-hand panel, we have a unit that is sort of the nodes in the network that is the neural network. And I think the most accessible way to think about this for the background of most sort of psych neuro folks is as if it was just sort of a GLM. GLM here, not using the fMRI sense of GLM, but in like the statistical sense of generalized linear model. And what that means is it's basically a linear regression, but you put on some kind of nonlinear activation function at the end. So we'll get into some of what the common ones are there. If you use something like the something like a little bit like a sigmoid here, you get something like logistic regression. So if you have a log activation function, you get a logistic regression. And by stacking lots of these nonlinear transformations on top of one another, you can end up learning sort of arbitrarily complex rules, which again is sort of one of the really powerful things about these networks, is just taking sort of relatively simple nonlinear transformations and combining them with one another allows you to learn really complicated things. And then the bottom panel here is showing what the training process looks like to some degree. So basically, you can think about the training process of a neural network as an optimization problem, where you want to learn the ideal sets of weights and biases, that is the slopes and intercepts of your GLMs, that accomplish whatever the goal of your network is. The goal is usually referred to as a loss function, and there's a loss landscape that is sort of the landscape you're trying to navigate and get to the sort of lowest valley and or highest hill, if you want to think about it as a peak rather than a valley. And unlike most of the models that you probably use in statistics, generally speaking, this is trained sequentially rather than all at the same time. So if you're doing like ordinary least squares regression, which is sort of the most common type, That's just sort of like one step of matrix math that yields at the end of it the answer, the best sort of slope and intercept. Whereas this, you kind of feed the data in a bit at a time. Those bits are called batches, and they're usually random subsets of the data. You really don't want to feed the data in most cases in the order it was collected, because that can lead to like catastrophic forgetting, where the network sort of learns one thing because it's all a bunch of correlated samples, and then it kind of forgets that when you feed in a different set of correlated samples. And then if you, so all the same data again multiple times, which you typically do, those are called epochs. So you say one set of batches is one epoch, and this completely covers all the different training examples. And then you feed them in a different random order, a different set of batches the second time around. And each time the model looks at the data and it compares what starts off as some random predictions to the actual answers that it should be getting. And says, okay, that's my loss. So I start off with this really high loss over here. It's a really bad answer. And then I use gradient descent. So I'm trying to walk down this slope to the lowest point. And at each point, I calculate what's the steepest way down the hill, right? If I'm standing on a hill and I can see the slope right around me, I can take the step that takes me the furthest down the hill with one step. And it does that over and over again until ideally it gets down to the lowest point in the overall landscape. Though, of course, just like any optimization algorithm, it can get stuck at local minima, and there are ways to try and mitigate that sort of problem if you're worried about it. That's sort of like a conceptual overview of what we're going to be doing here. Let's get into the actual code side of things. So here's where we're importing a bunch of packages. Some of this is not necessarily like the matplotlib inline thing is just a default on Colab, but this is so that if you loaded this as a local Jupyter notebook, it would work. And I haven't been smuggling things in here. You probably want to smuggle things in here if you're using it locally, right? But that's not necessary for any of these packages on Colab. So the main library we're using for the deep neural network stuff is PyTorch. So you see a bunch of stuff that has torch in the name there. And then we're using a couple of extra functions from stats models and scikit-learn, which are statistical and machine learning packages, respectively, and just pandas and numpy, which many of you are probably familiar with already, as sort of the numerical computing and data frame packages. One other thing we have here is just a quick check of what devices are available. Everybody has either a CPU, or if you're on a newer Mac, the MPS is sort of the newer Mac's processing thing. And then if you're on a GPU, particularly a NVIDIA GPU, you are going to have CUDA, which is sort of the driver that supports all this stuff. As Matt was alluding to earlier, it's installation hell for a lot of these packages if you're doing it locally. Colab is very convenient for skipping that sort of step. Of course, it's not going to allow you to run some of the big state-of-the-art models that are like pre-trained language models, for example, as Jeremy will be talking about in the NLP section later. That's just beyond the capacity of what Colab can handle in some instances. And next, we're going to simulate some fake data. So we're just going to be working with fake data for this, in part because my data doesn't look this clean. I don't know about yours, but I wanted to have some really clean and data where we knew the right answers basically in advance. So we're simulating this data. It has the same set of X variables. You can see how big the training set, the test set, and the validation set are up here. The X data is just random standard normal data. And the Y's, we're generating two different sets of Y values. One set's just linear data, and the other set is a nonlinear function of the X. It's just a quadratic function of the X. And in both cases, I'm adding a little bit of random noise to it as well, just so it's not a perfect relationship. But as you can see, it's pretty good. I'd love for my data to be this good, right? So what we're going to be trying to do is basically do a simple regression to begin with, but using a deep net. And this is, I think, a nice place to start if you have the background, which I think most of us in psychoneuro do, which is like we're really familiar with the regressions, but we aren't super familiar with deep nets. And we'll see how a deep net can sort of perfectly approximate a simple regression. All right, so here's where we begin this. So this is our creation of our model right here. So we're going to take in the PyTorch's neural network class and create this linear model, which has one input unit and one output unit. So the one input is going to be the X, and the one output is going to be the Y, right? So this is our entire model right here, as we'll see later. Usually the models are a little bit more complicated to define than that. We need to define a loss function. This is something you often don't have to think about when you're running like a linear regression because it always uses the same loss function. And here we're just using basically that same loss function, which is mean squared errors, right? So you want to minimize the sum of your squared errors. And then finally, we have to choose an optimizer. And so in this case, we're going to use stochastic gradient descent. Most neural networks use like some sort of variant of gradient descent to optimize themselves. We'll use a fancier one a little bit later, one of the popular ones called Atom, which is sort of a safe default to start off with. We're setting the learning rate real high here. Usually this is like 0.0001 or something like this. Oftentimes it's also variable. So you may want to set a learning rate that changes over the course of the training. As I mentioned, it's going to progress serially. So it makes sense to maybe learn more early on and then slow it down over time. In this case, we can set this really high because it's running a really simple relationship. So it doesn't need to take a long time to do that. And so here then is our training loop for this. So we're going to set some number of epochs. So this is some number of times we're going to show the model all the data. And then we're going to loop through that number of epochs. And each time we're just going to turn our input data, our X's and our Y's into values that PyTorch recognizes as tensors, so it doesn't like NumPy arrays and doesn't implicitly convert them. So we're just doing that here ourselves, turning them into floats and then into tensors, and then we just stick them into the model. So we have our model, and I think this is a pretty natural syntax in a sense that our model is creating some function that turns our inputs into our outputs. And after it does that, you then take the outputs and you compare them to what it should have output, our targets here. That's the actual Y values, and it computes a loss. So this is how wrong it was. And then it uses that to take one step towards optimizing the model. So it's updating the model's weights by that one step on each iteration. If you print it out yourself, you'll see something similar to this, where it starts with a relatively high loss, and then again, because this is such a simple problem, it gets that loss down to 0.01 very quickly. Now, usually when you're training a deep net, as we'll see, it takes a lot longer to get to sort of an optimal loss, and there are ways to determine how many epochs you need rather than just sort of fixing it to a set integer like this. Right, so these values are good. We can take a look at how good they are on the test set rather than the training set, and we can see they're also good here. So we have an R squared of 0.995, and we have an RMSE, that is sort of the average error, of just about 0.1. And if you remember right, the amount of noise we inserted into this relationship was 0.1. So this is the best the model could possibly do given the structure of the data. So great, we've learned this linear relationship, and we can compare it to what a traditional regression would do. So if we print out the weights and the biases, normally you don't do this because normally they're a little bit hard to interpret. But for this simple case, we can print out the weight, which is just the slope parameter of the neural network, and the bias, which is the intercept parameter of the neural network. And so we have a 1 and a 1.5. This is exactly what it should be given how we programmed the training data. We added a value of 0.1 up here when we were simulating this linear. We added a value of 1 and we multiplied by 1.5, right? So these are the exact slope and intercept parameters that we should have recovered given the structure that we built into the data. And we can see that if we look here at the stats model's results, so this is just the linear regression fit the good old-fashioned way, we get the exact same slope and intercept parameters here in the coefficients section. You can see 1.004, 1.5. So these two models have learned the exact same thing, but by a quite different programming process and by a different optimization process as well. Now, this is sort of the simple case where these two things are going to yield the same results, but of course, they're not always going to yield such similar results. And we're now going to start looking at some cases where they start to break down, right? Any questions about the linear case before we move on to the nonlinear case? Okay. So the nonlinear case, if you remember, we've simulated a quadratic relationship here. So it's a nice U shape. And the first thing we're going to try doing is just modeling that using the same linear model we used a second ago. And here I've formulated that same model kind of unnecessarily verbosely as like a class. So this is like the sort of more programmy way to do it. And I'm sure Jeremy would approve more of this way of formulating it. It's not a very useful class because it doesn't actually have any arguments or anything. But yeah, this could be the sort of baseline for starting to define like a real sort of neural network class that you could reuse over and over again in different contexts with different arguments, right? And one other thing that we're doing here is actually taking advantage of the GPU a bit more. So you can see that when we create this model, we're sending it to the device. Now it sounds like something from like one of those old Star Trek original series things, like take them to the device. But in this case, it's just taking it to whatever device earlier on you specified as the one that you're using. And if you're running our GPU runtime, that is set to the GPU. And that way you're guaranteeing that you're taking advantage of the GPU, which is usually going to be a much faster way to fit these models than CPU. And we've also defined now as functions our training loop and our testing function here, so that, again, we can kind of reuse these later on. And so these are just doing the exact same thing that we saw in the previous case, but formulated as a function where everything is sort of soft-coded rather than just a hard-coded sort of imperative function or imperative programming sort of approach. So it will either train the model or in this case, test the model and yield some nice output variables here. The other thing that we're taking advantage of is PyTorch's data loader class. This is basically something that you slot data into that will do some automatic things for you as it's feeding it into the model during training. So things that I mentioned earlier, like batching the data into batches, that's something you have to do manually. You don't have to sort of subdivide each time with some NumPy arrays. Now that data loader takes care of all that for you. And similarly, it will randomize the batches. It can also do a number of other cool things, but those are sort of the baseline things you're probably going to want to do pretty much all the time that it can take care of for you. We're just loading those into the data loader here. You can set batch sizes to different numbers. Generally speaking, if you make your batches bigger, it'll train faster, but it won't learn as much from each batch necessarily. Usually whatever batch size you want to set it to a power of 2 for sort of memory optimization purposes. Won't necessarily make a big difference in a really simple case like this, but if you were to train a really big model, that could be important. Here we just do sort of all the same training stuff again. This is exactly the same sort of training loop we saw before. Now, only difference is that everything's formulated in these functions and classes. We're using the nonlinear rather than the linear Y data, same exact X data. And you can see sad face here that over these epochs, as we go through things, the training loss and testing loss don't really decrease. So the model fit is not getting better. And that's because, of course, a linear model is not going to be able to capture this nonlinear relationship. So we can take a look at, the R squared, which is not 0 because it's sort of capturing one leg of the U. But it's this is sort of the plot of the predictions versus the actual values. And you see, of course, that it's not really capturing really any of that nonlinearity there, as you'd expect. So, the way that we deal with this, I think, in traditional sort of psych neurostats situations is that we would hand engineer a quadratic feature, right? I'd take my X variables, I'd look at this plot and be like, okay, my model's not working for an obvious reason. I'll multiply my X variable by itself and enter that into the regression as a second predictor. And that would actually work great with these data because these data are really simple and you can really clearly see the relationship. But the problem is when you have much larger data sets and much more complicated nonlinear relationships, that's really not going to scale up very well, right? Sometimes it's really hard to see as a human even what is the type of transformation that would work right? To do something like label each of 10,000 object categories from the images that go into them. Like I can't describe verbally what those rules are in most cases, right? And the great thing, or one of the great things about neural networks is that you can just sort of set them as objective and they can learn that for you. Now, a negative thing is that it's pretty then inscrutable to tell exactly whether it's learned to do it the right way or not. For example, there's a recent paper showing that you can actually classify in ImageNet all the object categories very accurately if you crop out the object itself and just look at the backgrounds, because the backgrounds are so correlated with the type of object that's in the image, right? You have to be really careful that your network's not cheating, because they'll find a solution that's not necessarily the one that you hope they'd find. But they often find solutions that we couldn't find by sort of manual feature engineering or stuff like that. So the first way we're going to solve this with DeepNet is using a shallow or wide DeepNet. So you've probably heard of deep learning. This is shallow learning. And in principle, shallow learning can actually do pretty much everything that deep learning can. It's just in practice, that's rarely the sort of smart way to go about things. So what shallow learning does is has one really wide, really large initial hidden layer, and then no sort of deep layers underneath that. So it's not deep, so that's why I call it shallow. But it is, it has to be wide. It has to have a lot of units in that initial layer. And what it does is rather than trying to learn sort of a complex nonlinear relationship, it just learns lots of local approximations to the nonlinear rule that can be sort of patched together to recreate the larger nonlinear relationship in question. And another way of conceptualizing what it's doing here is memorization. It is memorizing the relationships between each input value and each output value. It turns out you can get a long way in life with just memorizing things. That's how you get through medical school, I hear. It can be a surprisingly compelling sort of baseline comparison model if you're using this as like a cognitive model to see like, how far could you get with just memorization? And are participants actually doing anything beyond that, for example, right? So this can have uses within the type of work that we all do. If you're just trying to build, say, a useful computer vision model, this is probably not going to be the way you want to go about solving it. The deep networks instead, by stacking nonlinear transformations, can usually learn the same thing with fewer parameters, as we'll see. So here is our new shallow ANN class that we've defined. It's just the same as the previous one here, except for what's right in the middle here, which is that we're adding in this linear layer with 1,000 units in it. Now, we've gone from just sort of one unit as the entire network to sort of one input to 1,000 inputs, to 1,000 hidden units to one output. So that's the wide layer in the middle there. And each one of these layers is getting something extra that it didn't have before, which is this ReLU thing that's happening after it. This is taking the linear unit and adding the nonlinear activation function on top of it. So just like a GLM takes sort of a linear model and adds this like nonlinear, like logistic function on top of it at the end to model categorical data. ReLU in particular stands for rectified linear unit. Yeah, thank you. I always get that wrong. This is basically like a flat line and then some sloped line, right? So that's what we're seeing here. It's one of the most popular nonlinear activation functions, though we'll take a look at the one later. Okay, so we'll fit this to the data in pretty much just the same way. Only big difference here is that we've turned down the learning rate a lot, so it doesn't really quickly overfit. And then we'll wait for it to train, and you can see the training loss is now decreasing. And now this model's doing great. So we get our back up to an R-squared of 0.99 and an RMSE of 0.17, which again is about the best these models can do given the way they were trained. And this is what the relationship between the predictions and the actual values looks like. It's not quite perfect, but again, if my data looked this good, I'd be really happy in real life. And if we had more units and more data and so forth, this could be arbitrarily close to a perfectly straight line. But that highlights the limitations of the shallow networks is that they are just memorizing data. So if you want them to apply out of sample, you basically have to show them every possible case that could occur out of sample. And that's just not really feasible in the real world for most situations you're going to encounter. It could be possible in like tasks where you've constructed the world in question, which is why it could be useful to cognitive model, but not so much for things like, actually studying naturalistic interactions. And now, of course, we get to the start of the show, the deep neural network, what's been sort of really changing AI over the past decade or so. Here we're going to create a neural network that has many layers. They're all going to be smaller than the really big wide layer we just saw in the previous network. But because we're stacking them on top of each other, you'll see that they can do just as well with fewer units in question. So here's where we're defining the deep ANN. You see we just sort of have this like long set of layer definitions here, each one's linear followed by ReLU. And the one new thing that we're introducing here is this batch normalization. The batch normalization is basically like z-scoring the stuff that's flowing from one layer to the next, right? So you take one layer's outputs, that becomes the next layer's inputs, etc. And you're sort of z-scoring in between those things each time. The reason we want to do this is because otherwise you can have what's called an exploding gradient problem. You can basically have the numbers get really, really, really big, and that can cause numerical computing problems where they can't be really stored as like floats very well anymore and can cause major problems with model fitting. So this is sort of a little bit like regularization in that it keeps the numbers kind of within a nice tractable range, keeps them in the range that, floating point representations are really happy with, the computer's really happy with, and the optimization process can sort of flow along naturally. So at the end, we just have one linear output, just like we did before. So this is just predicting the Y variable. And we'll fit this in the same way that we saw before, with pretty similar parameters all throughout here, same optimization, slightly different learning rate, but pretty similar. And this is what I wanted to skip was training this. It doesn't take that long, but you can see this model does pretty well as well. So it also gets up to 0.98 with a fairly low RMSE. Here's what the relationship looks like. Pretty linear, looks good. And here, if you take a look at the code here, this is how we can print out how many parameters the model has. So this is all the weights and biases sort of summed across the entire network. And if we compare the shallow network, it has 3,001 parameters, and the deep net here has 900 parameters. So for a third of the parameter values, we've gotten basically the same performance by using a deep net instead of a shallow network. And also probably if we took the same data and extended it, so if we made the U go out further, for example, the deep net's going to generalize a lot better, most likely, than the shallow network in that sort of situation, because it doesn't need to have seen those values to know sort of the general rule that data is following. Okay, so the last code examples we're going to look at here is taking that deep net we just looked at, adding a few of the sorts of bells and whistles that are special to deep nets. Yeah. Basically, when you have multiple layers, it can sort of learn nonlinear transformations of nonlinear transformations. So maybe I actually will draw. So if you have something like, a single ray, that does not show up at all, so I will not do that. So if you have a single ReLU unit, right? So it looks like this, something like this. Then I can learn something in the next layer that is a ReLU of this ReLU. So I can learn something that goes like, this, right? And by doing that, I can learn ultimately a function that looks a lot like a U shape at the end of this whole thing. Whereas with the shallow network, what we're learning is like for each bit of the U, we're learning like a little local slope for that one bit, and then another bit, and another bit, and another bit, and another bit. And it's only the bits that we've seen that we're learning that linear approximation for. And so if we haven't seen a bit up here, we don't know what the linear approximation for it is, and we can't fit that part of the curve anymore. Does that make sense?
Which model generalizes the, would you kind of backtrack and then sort of infer what the generative model that the U-shaped model is from the detail?
Yeah, so maybe that's getting a little close to some of the stuff that is in the space of AI interpretability or explainability. And so it's basically trying to put in like human interpretable form what is happening within the guts of this deep neural network. And that can be a real challenge. A few different approaches have been taken to that over the years. One of them is trying to visualize the receptive field. So if you're working with image data, this works really well. And you can see in deep nets that have been trained to like learn computer vision tasks on naturalistic images that they learn representations at many of the layers that like look, kind of interestingly like the things that are in our visual cortexes, right? They look like things like oriented Gabor patches in the earlier layers, for example, and you get up to things that look a little bit more like object parts as you get to sort of the higher layers in the network. So that can be really helpful. Some networks are generative networks. So autoencoders, for example, are a nice example of this, where the autoencoder, you set it up the right way, you can kind of tell it to generate new things of a particular class with different parameter settings. So you can like look at each parameter and move it up and down and see like what is it doing differently. And Stefan's going to have a great talk about doing that with faces later on. So that I think will be a useful example of that. Yeah, I think the only other approach that I've heard, which is I think really interesting, is basically training other AI to tell us what the first AI is doing. So like Google DeepMind had a paper back in 2018 about sort of machine theory of mind, where you could train like one AI agent to learn to interpret the like goals and actions of another sort of deep RL agent, and sort of tell you what it's likely trying to do. And so this is another example of like how we could try and interpret like what any one network is doing, but it's definitely not a solved problem, I would say, in general, to sort of extract that out. Yeah. Okay, so these bells and whistles are basically some of the like ways of engineering deep nets that are really particular to artificial neural networks. So I'm not going to cover some of the things which are not particular here. So like one example of that is like regularization. So you can combine deep nets with any of the sort of normal regularization things that you do, like for example, the ridge penalty, right? Many of you probably used ridge regression before, it's great. You can throw a ridge penalty onto a deep net too in a few different ways, but that's not unique to deep nets. I'm going to try and focus on things which are a little bit more unique to deep nets here. So one of them is a skip layer connection. So what we've seen so far are networks that progress entirely sequentially. So you probably saw that sequential API. It's being called up here. Yeah, so nn.sequential, and then I tell it all the layers. This is very convenient if you have a network that just goes from like one layer to the next layer to the next layer to the next layer to the next layer in that sort of perfectly sequential way. This is a very easy and quick to use approach, but you don't have to do it that way. It has to be feed forward, but it doesn't have to go through every step along the way. So for example, you could go from like the first layer and skip a bunch of steps and go to a much later layer. And that way that later layer has access to both sort of high level and low level features. And that sort of thing actually makes a big difference. Some of the most successful computer vision models for say like object recognition rely on residual networks, which are basically that, but it's like not passing the entire information, just sort of the residual information forwards. So that's one example is that, and that's sort of a simple example of how you can engineer complex hybrid structures. So you can have sort of multiple input heads, as I was mentioning earlier, or multiple outputs, right? Where you're propagating different losses effectively sort of back through the model. That latter case is really useful for training things like deep reinforcement learning agents. So if you want to program an agent that actually does things in either a virtual or a real environment, then you probably want it to be able to like do multiple things, just like humans do multiple things. And so Google has some nice work on what are called auxiliary tasks. It can help the model learn just about the structure of the world around it, which is really useful if you want to say beat a game, but you want to tell it something beyond just like, did you win or lose? Because it's a big credit assignment problem there, right? If I have you play an entire game of chess, and you win or you lose, you don't know which specific move to attribute that to necessarily, especially if you're not having the sort of introspective experience of a human, but you're just sort of an AI making random moves to start out with. So if you at least learn stuff about the regularities in the world, that can be really helpful. All right, so another thing which you can choose is alternative loss functions or alternative activation functions, not loss functions. So ReLU is really popular, but there are a bunch of other ones, and they do matter a bit. So there's a really good paper on weight agnostic neural networks that doesn't have the model learn anything at all. Instead, it uses an evolutionary algorithm to learn what is the structure of the model that could best sort of survive any possible learning. So a model that can sort of be a little bit like the precocial chick that comes out of the, the egg ready to just peck right away, rather than the altricial type of bird where it has to be, fed by its mother for, a long period of time, right? The loss functions chosen by, or the activation functions chosen in that paper are very diverse, right? Suggesting that, like, to have the sorts of preparedness to learn certain things, what are often called inductive biases in the neural network literature. It's really useful to make use of multiple different activation functions. There are also some I won't cover here, but they're really important for sort of that final output layer. And those are softmax, if you're doing a sort of multi-label classification, the linear layer is usually the output for linear outputs, but you can have multiple linear units in that, that final layer. Dropout is a method of controlling for overfitting that is unique to neural networks and not really used by other types of models. So in dropout, basically you sort of have some of the cells sort of not work some percentage of the time. So every percentage of the time, every time you run the model, some of the nodes just kind of go on the fritz. And you could think about this in a biological sense as like, oh, this one's too tired to fire this time around, right? It's just fired an action potential. It hasn't gotten back on its feet, it's just not ready. But you don't need to think about it in that way either. You can just think about it as like, okay, this forces the model to learn many different subtrees, many different sort of ensembles of neurons that all get to the same endpoints. And it doesn't rely completely on any one of them to get to that point. It makes it more robust, prevents overfitting. And then finally, early stopping also helps to regularize the models, to prevent overfitting. Basically, this tracks the comparison between the loss on the training data, the data that the model's actually seen, and the loss on some held out data, which is usually called a validation set. So as the model learns, again, because it's learning sequentially, you can compare those two things. And ideally, they're both going down at first, but then at a certain point, they might diverge where it keeps getting better at the training data, but it sort of plateaus or even goes back up on the validation data. And that's a clear sign that the model is starting to overfit, right? That it's getting really, really good at this, memorizing this training data that's not actually improving at some out of sample data. So you can just cut the model off and say, okay, stop learning now. Don't do any more. This is enough. So this is just showing a code implementation of all those different things. So you can have some examples to work from if you wanted to build up to more complicated cases during hackathon projects, for example. So this is our fancy ANN class here that has all the different parts built into it. So here's our alternative activation function, which is the hyperbolic tangent function. It's kind of one of these S-shaped sort of things. The sigmoid function is very similar, but the sigmoid ranges between 0 and 1. So it's usually used as like an output class for binary classification. The hyperbolic tangent goes from -1 to 1 instead. So it's usually used in hidden layers. Here's where we're adding the dropout in the process. So we're just saying like each node has a 1% chance of failing effectively each time the model's run. And then here is where we're sort of joining up two of our different layers together with a skip layer, right? So we're concatenating right before the final output, the very first outputs from first hidden layer with the outputs from the last hidden layer, and sticking those two things together so that our final output has access to both sort of high-level features and low-level features of the data, which ideally could improve its fit. These things are not going to make a huge difference here. I'll just warn you, because none of them are really actually necessary for this process when we have such simple data. But these things can make a really big difference when you're working with real world data and help to prevent overfitting when you have more complicated relationships and maybe a little bit less data to work with, because you can't just simulate an infinite amount. And the last one here is I've written this early stopping class. So this basically just tracks, again, as I was saying, the comparison between our validation loss and our training loss. And when it gets big enough, that is to say, like when one of them stops improving for a certain number of steps, which is the patience variable here, then it will just cut the model off and not let it go on to the next effort. Here's where we train the model. So I've set the upper bound of epochs to a really high number, knowing that early stopping is probably going to cut it off a lot earlier. And I've set the learning rate pretty low. I'm also putting in a different learning or a different optimization function here called Atom, which tends to work a little bit better than stochastic gradient descent in many cases. So it's often like the default sort of place to start from. And here we see the model, starting to train, and its loss going down, which is great. And this one trains for a while, which is why I didn't run it for you live. So it goes through 14 epochs before it reaches a point where the validation performance has stopped increasing for long enough that the early stopping just cuts it off. And then we can look at its performance on the held-out test data. Now, importantly, the test data and the validation data are different, right? Otherwise, you can sort of overfit at the hyperparameter level effectively here. So the validation data is used to tell the model when to stop training. The test data is sort of the ultimate arbiter in this case of like how well the model ended up doing. That's totally out of sample. And it did really well. We did slightly better than the performance in the previous cases with an R squared of 0.992 and an RMSE of 1.55. Again, we don't need all these bells and whistles to do really well here. It looks great. Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's sort of like the introduction to coding that I wanted to give you. Again, this is incredibly basic neural network from the point of view of like conceptual, like what you could do with these things. But the coding is not trivial, so I wanted to focus on that element of it in this case, so that you could then scale up the conceptual part of it later with this as sort of a starting template for all the code. Some of the things that you could start thinking about next as you think about what I could use this for. One is sort of other layer connectivity patterns. So we've talked about these first two on the left over here, but there are some other ones which are really important. Autoencoders, for example, have this sort of hourglass shape where they sort of compress information down to sort of this bottleneck layer in red here, and then expand it back out. And usually what it's doing is taking in some input and then trying to recreate the input on the other side via some compressed representation. So you can actually have this do something which is basically like factor analysis or PCA. In fact, if you have all the layers here be linear, it just is PCA basically. It's just a linear or a network approximation, just like we saw earlier, network approximation of regression. But if you don't have the units be linear, you can have it learn cool nonlinear compressions of the data, which might compress the data a lot more. Convolutional neural networks are like the go-to for images or video because they use structured representations, these kernels, where the network isn't connected with all units to all units. Instead, let units at one layer only connected to sort of spatially proximal units in the previous layer. So like all of these units are connected to just one, and then all of these units, which are next to each other, again, in the image space are connected to just one, and so forth. So this sort of pyramidal sort of structure where there are only local connections, again, kind of resembles a lot of aspects of our visual cortex and helps these models learn representations that are similar to our visual cortex and that tend to be good for dealing with images and video and even things like audio if you do something like a spectrogram on it and have that sort of representation of data. Recurrent networks are ones that are sort of connected to themselves in time. So if you want to model time series or other sequential data, you want to be able to tell a network, okay, this unit was this active in the previous step in this sequence, and then be able to go forward from there. These have now largely been supplanted by transformers, which I haven't represented here because there's not sort of like a nice cartoon diagram that I could think of to represent them. But transformers use attention to basically reweight all of the connections in the network, or all the weights in the network based on the other things, right? So like just how we interpret a sentence based on all the words in that sentence, not just sort of the ones that are right next to it. The attention network can sort of reweight all those words appropriately. That's why these models have turned out to be sort of the basis for all the big large language models like GPT that are out there right now and are the state of the art in pretty much most applications of the fields of deep learning. And another thing you can think about when you're figuring out where you want to go next is like, what is the application you actually want to pursue with deep learning? So one approach would be to do sort of the biomarker clinical approach, right? So you take in brain data or something else, physiology, for example, behavior. You run it through some deep net, and at the end of it, it predicts something useful about a person. So it could be like a phenotype in a clinical sense, right? So it could be do they have like depression? Do they have are they on the autism spectrum, et cetera? or some treatment that might work for that particular person. So it's like, oh, would they benefit more from drugs or therapy or whatever? Then ideally, there's this person in the middle who's like a human who will interpret the outputs of those things. So I don't think we should be trusting these like right out of the bat without a lot of validation. But they could be useful for clinicians to counsel and treat patients. Another possible approach here is the annotation approach. This is if you're working with naturalistic data, I think what a lot of people are going to be wanting to do, right? So you take in something like an audiovisual recording of a social interaction, you feed it through a bunch of pre-trained neural networks. Even if you don't have to create those yourself, it's useful to know how they work. And then this gives you a bunch of annotations of things like facial expressions or speech or tone of voice and body pose and gesture. And you can do a whole bunch of stuff with that, like measuring synchrony, as we were hearing about earlier today. And the final thing, I think, sort of the broad categories of stuff that you can do with these is cognitive modeling, right? So you train your model and a human on the same task, and then you see how the activations or the weights that are learned by the network or its ultimate sort of performance approximates things in the human brain or approximates the behavior of participants or different aspects of physiology. And there's some things that are probably better modeled by deep nets than others. So for example, if you have like really fast feedback processes involved, we know there's a lot of feedback in the brain. Not all of those are going to be well captured by a deep net that's entirely feed forwards, right? It's not going to capture those quick feedback dynamics necessarily, but there are other types of networks, not these type of networks, that can be used as cognitive models for those things. And then I just have a bunch of learning materials here at the end. So there's PyTorch's official tutorial materials that you can dig into deeper. TensorFlow has similar stuff, which is the other sort of main competing Python library for deep learning. Some important websites. So if you want to find the best state-of-the-art sort of pre-trained models, Papers with Code is a really good place to go. If you want to actually run those models, Hugging Face is a model repository that has a lot of models with sort of a standardized format and installation that can make it a lot easier to use them. And DeepMind has a nice blog on a lot of their really cutting edge research, which I recommend checking out for slightly more digestible content. There are a bunch of good videos you can get into more deeply. Neuromatch's course on deep learning and autoencoders, NYU's deep learning course. If you want to get into reinforcement learning in particular, the reinforcement learning boot camp's now a little bit dated, but I think a really good starting place. And really digestible stuff from 2-minute papers. And then finally, if you want to see like what I think is really cool in this space, you can check out the citation list in these preprints that we put out recently. So that's it for this. And I'm happy to take any questions at this point. Yeah.
So using deep networks for cognitive modeling, do you have a preferred way of interpreting network activation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to depend a lot on like what the question is involved. So I can give like some examples of that, right? So one of the most common sort of paradigms that people have applied so far, it's not particularly social, is just looking at different layers within, say, CCN, CNN, convolutional neural network, and mapping those onto like different regions up sort of the visual hierarchy. So like V1, V2, et cetera, all the way up to like, inferior temporal cortex, and seeing like via something like RSA is like the similarity of stimuli as far as the network's concerned, its activations in that layer, a good model, capturing what's happening in terms of the patterns of brain activity measured through, say, fMRI or something like that. That's definitely a popular approach. You can also think about other ways of trying to do that. So like one of them would be like learning. So does it learn at the sort of in a similar way, like over time, if you have participants doing a learning task at all? So like comparing trajectories of like the emergence of representations in particular regions with how those seem to emerge in the network. I think it's a really neat way of doing about things. Another way that taps into what I was talking about earlier about networks doing things the wrong way is looking at error patterns in the actual final predictions that a network makes. So is it actually making sort of the same confusion matrix at the end in a classification task that your human participants are making? It's a nice sort of behavioral endpoint for some of those things. Yeah, I think that's like a few examples of that. I'm happy to dig in deeper to any of that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, but that's microvisual system is kind of uniquely, useful to be able to map onto deep networks versus other systems, right? Because it has such a strong hierarchy.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, so I think, if you're thinking about like social side of things, we do know some things about what some parts of the social brain do, I hope. Right, so like one example would be if you started a network, as I was talking about earlier, that had like the different sort of sensory modalities in a social interaction sort of separated at first. So you sort of had one CNN that was dealing with like visual inputs, another one that was dealing, or like maybe just face inputs, another one that was dealing with just like body pose inputs, right? Another one that was dealing with just voice inputs or just like sort of the text that's behind that voice. And then you let them merge up to like one layer where they're being integrated and then go on to some, final product. Then you could look to see like, is that representation like a good model for, say, posterior superior temporal sulcus, where we think there's a lot of like multi-modality fusion going on potentially, right? I think that's like one example where we can like, there's a nice like hierarchy underneath social stuff, but like we can start to look at some of like the endpoints of that as they emerge into the social domain. Yeah.
You mentioned transformers, and I feel like I've heard a lot of buzz around those, but don't really understand what they're doing. Could you say a bit more about when you would use them and why they're helpful?
Yeah. Transformers, they're relatively recent innovation. There's a paper called like Attention is All You Need, basically showing that like, these can approximate lots of other networks like LSTMs, which were really popular before that, which are type of recurrent neural network. Those were doing a lot of the language processing. They basically showed like, you can approximate anything that an LSTM can do and more with these sort of attention units that are at the core of transformers. They're a bit complicated, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give like a long or a sufficient sort of explanation of them in this context. But again, the basic idea is you have this sort of attention head that can take in sort of something like a word embedding that is just sort of static. So you have like the exact same embedding for the word bank, whether it's a money bank or a river bank. And it can look at the other words around that, so sort of the context, and change that vector to make it sort of contextually specific, to make it into sort of a specific representation of a river bank versus a money bank. So that's sort of like a high level idea of sort of what it's doing and why it's so useful in stuff like language, which is so contextual like that. And I think probably also going to be really useful in a lot of social contexts, whether they're verbal or not, are also super contextual, as we all know from social psychology just generally, right? So I think they're probably going to have broad uses, and usually they're going to be among the sort of state-of-the-art performance, at least for a lot of tasks that we deal with in the natural world.
So the transformers kind of enable some of the more advanced language models like ChatGPT.
Yeah, pretty much all of the like state-of-the-art language models like ChatGPT are powered by transformers under the hood right now. They have lots of other stuff going on too, but like that's pretty close to their core. Yeah, of course. Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, in that case, I will be around for the rest of the week, obviously, and happy to answer more questions as you start to do these things and realize like, oh shit, Mark didn't explain this part. Hopefully you can make use of these as tools in some of your hackathon projects.